for you much, but there is a 20-second lag between what you're saying and what they see, because it's jumping from Zoom to YouTube to SwapCard.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
But I don't think that's going to matter since they're not actually like talking to you or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So you're up on SwapCard.
Great.
So I'm going to mute myself.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to be starting in a minute or two. In the meantime, I'll tell you, this is being brought to you by the magic of some really amazing technology that I don't even think existed like 10 years ago. So I'm calling you from the middle of nowhere in Nevada. It's a little town called Denayo Junction, and I'm in the middle of a camping trip, and I've got this amazing solar panel that lets me charge my laptop, and I'm tethered to my phone, and it seems like it's kind of working, which is wild. So yeah, we're going to start in a couple of minutes. All right, so while we're just about ready to start, a reminder that you can ask questions and chat inside of SwapCard. I will be giving a presentation, well, I'll be giving an introduction, and then I'll be giving a presentation, and then I'll be doing Q&A. And it'll be split about 50-50 between the presentation and the Q&A. So post your questions about anything related to anxiety or algorithms related to anxiety or whatever inside of SwapCard. And I think it's about time to get started. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got a little PowerPoint presentation, and then we're going to come back and do the Q&A in a few minutes. All right, so today I'm here to talk about anxiety algorithms. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of background for how I came upon this, idea or set of ideas, where it came from, and how I found it useful for myself and the companies that I advise. Now, my guess is that if you're watching this, you're watching it because you're a little anxious. And I used to be very, very anxious when I was running a travel startup called Hipmunk. Now, Hipmunk was started by me and a co-founder back in 2010, literally the day after I graduated from MIT. And the experience of running Hipmunk was really, really stressful, and unexpectedly so. I mean, I figured that startups would be stressful, but there was something about Hipmunk that really surprised me, which is that as we got more traction, I got more stress. So, when we were first starting out, it was mostly exciting. But by the time we had employees and investors and board members and partners and all of these other different things, which from the outside looked like we were being successful, I felt more and more anxious every day. And that's how I started thinking about this, because I was wondering, being an engineer, why am I designed this way? Is this a bug in me, in humans in general, or is this actually a feature and I just don't understand it? And so that motivated me to start thinking about, why is it that I started getting more anxious as we got more successful? And talking to other founders and other managers, it seems like this is nearly universal. As people get more responsibility, as they get more traction with their companies, as they take on bigger teams, it seems like almost universally they end up feeling more anxious. And so that was the motivation. And that got us to the big idea, which I developed over the course of about a year after leaving Hipmunk and reflecting on my time. And the big idea is this. You can think of anxiety as an algorithm that has specific design constraints, specific trade-offs, and that you can actually reason about and change based on the trade-offs that you want in your life. A reminder for those who are just joining, you can ask questions or throw in your thoughts inside of SwapCard, and I'll be answering those towards the end. So I think of anxiety as part of a broad category of algorithms, which I call threat algorithms. And this is broader than just anxiety. The first step of a threat algorithm is to determine whether something is actually a threat. And then the second step is to decide how to respond. So another great example of a threat algorithm is our immune system, because our immune system has to deal with lots of uncertainty. Bacteria, viruses, those are evolving way faster than we are. And the way our immune system deals with it is it first makes a set of everything it could ever encounter. That's how humans have managed to survive, despite the fact that we're evolving way more slowly than bacteria and viruses. Basically, when we're very young, our bodies make a set of everything we could ever encounter. And then it observes the first time that it encounters each one, and then determines whether it was, good or bad, so that it knows how to deal with it in the future. Now, this first point about making a set of everything that our immune system could ever encounter is a really interesting problem. It's a really interesting algorithm, because it seems on its face to be impossible. How could our bodies make a set of everything that they could ever encounter, including viruses or bacteria that no human in existence or in history has ever seen? Well, I've got a little video here about discovery, Nobel Prize-winning discovery, by an MIT professor that explains how this works.
People are full of antibodies, a lot of antibodies. These proteins are a vital part of the immune system, but just how the body makes such a variety of them mystified scientists for decades. The human immune system has to fight off an endless variety of bacteria, viruses, and parasites, and for each invader, it needs a specific antibody. Luckily, it can generate billions of them, each slightly different, ready for any disease. But these antibodies, made from 2 light chains and 2 heavy chains, are proteins. And billions of different proteins should need billions of genes to make them. Humans have around 20,000 genes. The solution to this problem was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. Antibodies are made by B cells. Like every other cell, B cells start off with the same 20,000 genes. But they also have an enzyme called RAG. RAG is a DNA shuffler. It targets the genes that make the antibody's binding site. There are 3 kinds of gene segments here, called V, D, and J. For the heavy chain of the antibody, humans usually have around 130 different V segments, 27 D segments, and 6 J segments. The RAG enzyme binds to one of the J segments at random, and then to one of the D segments, chopping off the spare DNA between them. Other enzymes then join the ends together. The same thing happens with a random V segment. So you end up with a gene composed of 1 V, 1 D, and 1 J joined together. This provides over 20,000 possible VDJ combinations for the heavy chain. The light chain can have another 400 possible gene combinations. Combining heavy and light chains gives approximately 8 million different possible antibodies, each with a different binding site. not all, during the joining, extra DNA is added or removed at the junctions of the segments, which takes our antibody diversity from the millions into the billions. This is how our immune system can respond to diseases it's never even seen before. In fact, there's so much diversity that one of our antibodies could potentially bind to almost any target in the whole universe.
So that's how it works. Our immune system, magically, is able to figure out pretty much every virus or bacteria that could ever exist by randomly shuffling up little snippets over and over and over again until it's essentially imagined every virus or bacteria that could ever exist. Now, the way that I like to imagine this, and this is obviously a gross oversimplification, is that basically there is a conceptual space. There's a space of possible threats. And here I'm, showing it in 2 dimensions, so obviously it's quite a bit bigger than that. And basically the way that our immune algorithm works is that it explores the space at random. So it first imagines one at random, and then it keeps imagining more until it's basically imagined the whole thing. Now, what does this have to do with anxiety? Well, to me, again, these are all part of the same umbrella, the same family of algorithms that need to deal with threats. Threats that are evolving faster than we are. Because the reality of human existence is that the things that are dangerous today are not all the same as the things that were dangerous last year, 10 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. And so we need an algorithm. If we want to survive effectively, we need an algorithm that allows us to anticipate not just microscopic threats like viruses and bacteria, but macroscopic threats, things that could affect our families, our countries, our whole world. And that's what anxiety is really good at. Conceivably, or conceptually, the way that I imagine it is that there's a space in our head of possible threats. And when your company or your team is very small, the number of ways that things could go bad is fairly small. Before you have employees, you're not imagining what might happen if your employees quit. Before you have a board, you're not imagining what might happen if your board members try to fire you. But as your company gets more traction, or as your team gets bigger and more responsibility, the space of possible threats explodes because the number of these little snippets that can be shuffled up into worrisome futures also explodes. And so to me, that helps me understand what's going on in terms of, why it is that as I got more successful and as the founders I work with got more successful, the number of fears exploded, and how they just kind of pop up at random, like in the middle of the shower or as you're falling asleep. Now, the thing about this is that it's not all bad. This ability to shuffle up little snippets of the past or of things you've imagined into futures that could exist is the root of both anxiety and creativity. And I don't think it's a coincidence that founders and managers who have really high creativity, who can imagine products or marketing strategies or, financial techniques that no one else has ever used before. I don't think it's a coincidence that people who are really imaginative and creative also tend to rank really highly in terms of anxiety. Because underlying all of it is this ability to take little snippets of things that have existed before and shuffle them into new futures that no one has ever imagined before. Now, the second part of the immunity algorithm is responding to a threat or responding to something that you're not sure is a threat. And that difference between something you're sure about and something you're not explains a lot about anxiety and our immune system for that matter. In a perfect world, we'd be able to perfectly distinguish between things that are definitely threatening and definitely not threatening. We'd have some line that we could draw down the middle, and we'd say, hey, anything that's on this side, we're going to attack it because it's a threat, and anything on this side, we're going to ignore it because it's not a threat. But the real world doesn't work that way. At best, we have some probability likelihood that something is a threat. There are certain things that are at the extremes that are either extremely dangerous or extremely safe, but in the middle, there's a lot that's not clear. And so the question is, where should we draw the line? I call it the paranoia line. Where is the mathematically optimal place to draw the line so that we survive as high as a percentage of the time as possible? You might think, well, if you draw it down the middle, then you can be sure that you're making the best bet possible. But actually, the answer depends on the costs and benefits of being right versus wrong on either side of the line. To me, the best way to model this is using a payoff matrix, which is familiar to those of you who've studied game theory or certain kinds of economics. There's two possibilities of reality. One is that it's a threat and the other that it's not. There's also two possibilities in terms of how you respond. And there's different payoffs depending on where you end up in this matrix. So let's just assume that if it's a threat and you respond, you survive. You attack the virus or you attack the dilemma that's threatening your company and you survive. Similarly, let's assume that something's not a threat and you don't respond, you survive. Now things get more interesting on the other corners. I'm going to suppose that if something is a threat and you don't respond, you die. Now, of course, you could argue with this. This is just meant to simplify and explain kind of conceptually a basis for how to think about these kinds of trade-offs. But let's imagine that if your body just ignores smallpox, if it doesn't even try to mount an attack, that you're going to die. But on the flip side, if something is not a threat and you respond, you're probably going to survive most of the time. And the reason for that is that usually, if something's not a threat and you attack it, it's not going to be something that you needed to live. For example, if you get some pollen in your nose, that's not going to kill you. And if you respond to it, you're going to sneeze. You might have allergies. You might have a runny nose or a headache, but you're not going to die. That said, there are occasions in which responding to something that's not a threat could actually kill you. If your body attacks your own, let's say, blood cells, that could be a real problem. So let's just, again, for simplicity's sake, let's say that if you attack something that's not a threat, you have a 90% chance of surviving. So if you add this all together, it suggests that you should draw the line way, way over to erring on the side of caution, which is to say, if there's even a 9% chance that something could be dangerous, you should treat it as though it is dangerous and you should attack it. That's what the math suggests. Now, what are the consequences of being so extremely reactive? Well, in the case of our immune system, it explains a lot. It explains allergies. It explains certain gastrointestinal disorders, all a result of our body attacking things that look like they might be threats but actually aren't. And we suffer as a result. And the question then comes, can we do better than that? And to me, the answer is yes, we certainly can. But only if we don't leave it to its own devices. If we give it help, if we use medicine, we can do much better. We can, for example, use targeted immunosuppressants if someone has an overly strong immune reaction, an unnecessarily strong immune reaction. Or we can provide tools that help out in individual cases. Skin cream that helps to counteract the effects of a rash that's a result of an allergy, for example. So what does this have to do with anxiety? Well, I think the analogies are really strong. Again, we have this amazing ability to imagine the future, and some of the futures that we imagine would be really bad. If we lose our house, that could be really bad for us. That could threaten our ability to survive or provide for our family. But there's also a lot of stuff that we spend a lot of time worrying about that is very, very unlikely to kill us. And it's really very unlikely to make us suffer that much. I can tell you, running out of toilet paper sounds terrible, but I've been camping now for about 2 weeks straight, and it's not the end of the world. Really, it's not. It's not. So the point here is we have this ridiculously effective mental system for imagining futures, but when we take this paranoia line that's calibrated to fear the worst in just about all circumstances, then you get this interplay where anytime or almost any time that you imagine a future, you start to worry that it could be really bad. And if you're someone who's really creative, you're probably imagining a lot of futures, and so you're probably spending a lot of time worrying. And if you're running a company that's growing and getting traction, you're imagining more and more futures. And most of them seem threatening, and so you can easily become overwhelmed with the amount of fear and anxiety. And that's exactly what happened to me when I was running Hipmunk as we grew. Now, where do we get these inputs from? I'm going to briefly talk about this because I think it's really interesting and significant. Where do we get these snippets, these things that we shuffle up to imagine possible futures? Well, one place is direct experience. If you have an employee who quits one day, now you're going to be really, really paying attention to the possibility that other employees could quit. But that's not the only place that you can get these snippets from. It's not the only place that you can get these snippets of fear. Another place is imagining them. So you could be sitting at home. No one could have quit your company yet, but you could imagine what it might be like for someone to quit. And lastly, you could hear it from other people. And these are all different sources of input, and they all have different benefits and disadvantages. The way that I think about it, our attention is like a portfolio of investments. We either consciously or unconsciously decide how much of our attention to invest in direct experience, that is, living in the real world and seeing what's going on, how much we spend in our own head, that is, with our imagination, and how much we listen to other people, reading the internet, reading the news, whatever. The benefit of direct experience is that it's real. If you experience something directly, that's real. The disadvantage is that it could kill you. Right? To take an example, if you're camping in the middle of the woods and you're like, hey, I wonder if that mushroom is safe to eat, and you experiment by trying it with your direct experience, you might die, and that might be the end of that experiment. So if you don't die, you're certain that it's not dangerous. You're certain that it's safe. But it's very risky to rely exclusively on your direct experience. What about imagination? Well, the nice thing about imagination is that it's very unlikely to kill you. If you're just sitting there at home thinking about possibilities, you're not actually out there trying the poisonous mushroom. But on the flip side, because your imagination is fed from previous experiences that you've had, it can easily be miscalibrated for the new reality. You see this all the time for people who let their skills go stale, right? They're thinking about how to solve problems the way that they did when they were in college. I'm guilty of this myself. And it turns out there's much better techniques. Artificial intelligence has progressed dramatically in the last 10 years. But if I use my imagination fed just by my past experience, I'm not going to get the right answer. And other people have their own costs and benefits, right? If someone else points out the dangerous mushroom, that's great. That's great. That means that I'm not going to eat it. But other people might have ulterior motives. Maybe that mushroom's not actually dangerous, but the person told me it is so that I move on and then they can take it for themselves. So each of these three different sources of input has its own costs and own disadvantages. And if you think of it in terms of a portfolio approach, it actually provides a really helpful framework for understanding where you are. So think of this in terms of stocks and bonds, right? In terms of a financial portfolio. If the world is safe, you probably want to put a lot of money into stocks because while they are riskier, they tend to go up more over time. But if you're really scared, you probably want to shift your allocation to bonds. This is you can prove mathematically that there are different amounts that you should shift your investment depending on how risk averse or risk seeking you are and how confident you are in the underlying risks that you believe. Similarly, if you believe that the world is really safe, or if your subconscious mind believes that the world is really safe, it's really great. You can go out and spend most of your attention investing in direct experiences. You can go and, try a bunch of new things because you're pretty confident that you're going to survive and actually grow from the experience. But if you believe that the world is dangerous, for any reason, if you believe it yourself or if you heard it from someone else, it's rational in terms of survival maximization to shift your portfolio away from direct experience and spending more time in your head and listening to other people. And I've experienced this firsthand, and all the founders that I've talked to have the same experience, which is that the more stressed out we get, the more time we spend in our head and the more time we spend doing things like reading the news, checking the internet, and doing other things that keep us from direct experience. Now, why am I sharing this? Because I think it's a great clue. If you notice yourself spending a lot of time in your imagination, i.e., sitting there and ruminating about some problems that you have at work, that's a great clue that deep down, you actually are really worried that the world is a dangerous place or that your company is at risk or whatever. In essence, what I'm suggesting is that the amount of your time that you're spending in each of these different areas is a clue to how stressed out you are. And also that you can make yourself less stressed out by deliberately shifting the allocation of your attention to things that clue your body in and your mind in to the idea that actually things are okay. So if you spend more time in direct experience, whether that's playing a musical instrument or meditating or anything where you're directly experiencing life, then you're going to train yourself to believe that actually things are going to be okay. And the more of your time that you spend in your head or reading the news, the likelier you are going to amplify the anxiety. And I've experienced that firsthand. So how do I use this in my life? Well, the first thing is that I recognize anxiety as a series of algorithms. It's not an accurate reflection of the world, not even close. Just because I'm imagining that something could happen doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. It just means that I'm running this randomization algorithm in my head that's constantly shuffling up and imagining possible threats for the future. The second thing is I can change the inputs. This is a really easy change to make. If I give my anxiety bad inputs, it's going to start worrying about things that aren't relevant to me. So how did this happen at Hipmunk? Well, I spent a lot of time reading different news sites, different tech sites that were talking about the struggles and the techniques for dealing with them for companies that were getting near IPO. And we were nowhere close to IPO. We were just early on. But all of a sudden I was getting these concepts about, financial reporting and organizational structure that were completely irrelevant to me, but they started to filter into my thoughts and anxieties. And so the point that I'm suggesting here is, if you want to be as successful as possible in running your business or running your team, choose to allocate your attention to the things that are actually relevant to your company or to your team. Don't spend your time just reading the news generally or reading the tech-specific news, or don't spend too much time doing it, because you could end up easily having your mental algorithms spending most of their time shuffling those inputs up. Now, a reminder for those of you who recently joined, as we get near the end of this presentation, please ask any questions that you have inside of the app that you're watching this in, and then I'll be answering those in a few minutes. Another thing that you can do to reduce anxiety is you can change the parameters. So recognize that we are deliberately designed to err way on the side of caution, to assume the worst, because it's helped us to survive. Our bodies do it, our minds do it. It's an ultimately rational trade-off for any sort of threat detection system if the goal is to maximize the odds of survival. But also realize that we are calibrated for a very different world than the world that we actually live in. If you imagine back in the day, before there were, corporations, before there were startups, before there was any of these concepts, if you started any sort of endeavor or enterprise and it failed, it could be disastrous for you. You could be personally liable for all of the losses that you've incurred. You could lose access to a place to live, to food. You could be ostracized by your community. The outcome for screwing up back in the day in terms of any sort of entrepreneurial exercise was dramatically worse than it is today. And yet, it seems to me like deep down, the fear of failure is often calibrated as though failure could mean utter disaster, could mean death, and it doesn't anymore. My first startup failed completely failed. We ran out of money and that was it. And I was really worried before that. I was worried that it was going to mean that, I'd never be able to start another company. No one would ever invest in me, that I'd be miserable for the rest of my life. None of those things actually happen. And the reason is because these days, no one really cares. If your startup fails, your investors might even still invest in your next company. And if they don't, there's lots of other investors out there who are eager to invest in founders who've learned some good lessons from their previous companies. Yeah, you might lose your paycheck, but we do have some amount of a social safety net. You can go on unemployment. You can at least collect a little bit of money while you figure out what to do next. It is very unlikely that if your startup fails, you are going to starve to death. And that was the case back in the day, and that is how our fear is calibrated. So if you recognize that our parameters are tuned wrong, it can give you a little bit of a counterpoint when these fears start to come up. And you can, over time, recalibrate them. For me, when I had the fear with Hipmunk, oh my God, if this fails, it's going to be a disaster. I would remember back to my first startup, and I said, it's actually probably not going to be a disaster if Hipmunk fails, because my first startup failed, and I was sad for like a week, but then I moved on. So by sort of reflecting on previous times where you've recognized that you've been overly concerned about things, you can slowly recalibrate your fears in the present. That's our paranoia line. Remember, it's set way, way up on the end of erring on the side of caution, and you can slowly nudge it down. Lastly, you can reallocate your attention. Rumination, getting stuck in your head, is a result of reallocating your attention because you fear direct experience, but it's also a cause of it. And when you notice yourself stuck in your head or watching the news, you can shift your attention. You can reallocate your attention portfolio to things that are more likely to relax you and to reinforce a sense that things are actually going to be okay. Instead of scrolling through Twitter for 45 minutes, how about taking a 45-minute walk outside? Some final thoughts here. If you find this interesting, you can read more about it on my blog. I've written 3 separate essays that cover each of the 3 algorithms that I ran through today. The first on how we imagine the future, the second on how we decide which futures to worry about, and the third about where we get our inputs, how we allocate our attention portfolio. My website is adamjuliangoldstein.com. You can go there. You can subscribe to my mailing list if you want to get updates when I publish other stuff. And if you've got any questions related to this that you don't feel comfortable asking in the chat, you can email them to me at adamjuliangoldstein@gmail.com. But I hope that if you do have questions, you'll ask them inside of the app, because then everyone else can get the benefit of it. We've now reached the end of the presentation, so please put any questions that you have into the app or into the chat, and we will, I'll answer them in the order that they come in. I'm going to switch now so you can see me. Remember, if you've got questions, please post them into SwapCard. You can post them there, and then everyone can see them, and I can answer them. Reminder to those watching, you can ask questions inside of SwapCard, and then everyone can see them and I can answer them there. All right, strategies for converting anxiety to a positive force. That's a great question. So the first thing that I think about with this is remembering that this shuffling up of different snippets to imagine different futures it's a double-edged sword. It is. It's something that can be incredibly powerful for, making new art or music or innovating within your company. And it can also be something that's really dangerous by starting to imagine all of the ways that things could go poorly for you and then become a feeder of anxiety. So to me, it's a couple of different steps. The first is when I start to notice myself worrying, I ask myself, hey, is this something that I should actually be worrying about? Or is this a result of my paranoia line being set way, way over on the edge, worrying about just about everything because that's what it's trained to do? So, by sort of challenging the worry, by saying, hey, is this something I actually need to worry about? Is this something that's actually a good use of my mental energy? Then I can decide. I can say, actually this one is. If COVID-19 had happened when I was running Hipmunk, you bet I would be spending a bunch of time worrying about what it meant because travel was going down the tubes. So that's a good one to worry about. That's something that's worthwhile. But worrying about, various employees of my company quitting or something like that, that was not a great use of my time. Maybe for like a minute. Hey, are people doing okay? Is this something for me to worry about? Yeah, people seem to be doing okay. Great. I don't need to worry about that anymore. Or are people doing okay? Actually, no, some people are not super happy. Maybe I should talk to them, one-on-one and see how they're doing. That's like a very practical thing to do, but no one needs to spend hours or days in their head worrying about these things when they could just answer the question with a quick conversation with someone. So when I notice, these sorts of fears coming up, I'll ask, is this something I need to worry about? And if not, then I'll just, reallocate my attention to something more directly. And this actually relates to your other question about camping. So as I said, I think being outdoors is an amazing dose of direct experience that can counteract the stress that almost inevitably comes from reading the news, from being on social media, or from just getting stuck in your own head. I made a decision when the lockdown began that I was going to check the news no more than once a day and check social media no more than once a day and way, way increase how much time I was spending outside. And I've been way less stressed as a result. Now, I'm also really lucky that I'm able to do that. I'm not suggesting that that's something that, everyone can do or everyone should do. But I am suggesting that there's probably things that everyone can do to at least reduce some of the stressful inputs that are happening. Maybe it's reading the news less. Maybe it's reading social media less. Maybe it's starting the morning by going for a 5-minute walk or doing a 5-minute meditation instead of immediately turning the phone on and seeing who's messaged. All of these are little changes that in aggregate can reduce the number of worrisome snippets and increase the sense that actually, things are going to be okay. Now, one more thing to say on that, which I think is important, is that a lot of first-time founders, including me back when I was running Hipmunk, really struggle to believe that being less stressed out, being less anxious, is actually going to be better for them. If you told me back then, hey, Adam, you should be less stressed out because you'll be a better CEO, I would have said, no, you don't understand. If I'm not this stressed out, we're not going to succeed as a company. We're in this incredibly difficult industry, running this travel business. How are we ever going to survive if I'm not stressing out about it all the time? And if I'm not stressing out about it, who else is going to stress out about it? Well, here's what I've actually learned, both before and after selling Hipmunk. Stress can be useful to an extent, but only to the extent that it's calibrated appropriately for real life. When I was losing sleep for weeks and months, imagining what bad things could happen and how it would be a disaster for me or for the company, those were weeks and months that I was not spending focusing on how to make the company as successful as possible. In other words, my fears were oriented around preventing the worst case scenario, which is what they're designed to do. Instead, if I'd invested my time into imagining how to make the best case scenario more likely, or to put some amount of time into both, a little bit of time preventing the worst case scenario and a little bit of time imagining how to maximize the best case scenario. If I just reallocated my attention that way and interrupted the anxieties on this side, at least some of the time, we would have actually been much more successful. And I see this with lots and lots of first-time founders. They have this deep-seated belief that the anxiety is what's keeping them alive. And it might be true, but it's not what's ultimately going to make them hugely successful. And the founders that I've invested in and that I've served on the boards on who've been the most successful have been the ones who've been able to turn down the anxiety when they notice it getting out of control and putting those mental cycles into thinking big ideas about the future. All right, let's see if we've got any other questions. A reminder, in Swap Card, you can ask questions so that everyone can see them. That's my preference, so that everyone can see them and we can answer them. And people can ask follow-up questions. Let's see if anyone else has got one. Oh, I hear that we're having issues with attendees being able to use the chat. That's a shame. Well, if that turns out to be the case, perhaps we can schedule a separate short Q&A for another time when it's working better. But hopefully, we can get that resolved in the next few minutes, and we can use the rest of the time today to answer questions that people have. All right, so we're going to wrap up now. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to answer some questions another time. I've done a few of these presentations for this group, and I'm sure I'll do more in the future. Again, if you've got other interest in this, if you're interested in learning more or chewing on these ideas some more, I'm going to share the slide again where you can get information about the essays and my direct email address so that we can continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today, and I hope that you find this helpful in reducing your anxiety during these crazy times. Oh, wait, we have another question. Wow, just in time. Teddy asks, what do you think most people are stressed out about right now that they should be less stressed out about? Ooh, great question. So I think that the thing that I notice the most about entrepreneurs being stressed out about is that they are stressed out that the stress will never end. That is the number one thing when I talk to founders and I dive into the source of their stress. The number one thing that seems to stress people out is the idea that the stress is going to continue and get worse. And I think it's really interesting because in a sense, their mind kind of has a good reflection on itself. If people are anxious, it is reasonable to worry that in the future the anxiety will still be there. But also, if people are able to reduce their anxiety, then they don't need to be so worried about the fact that they might be anxious in the future. Again, to me, and in my experience in working with a lot of founders, the most interesting thing is that it's not the idea of outright failure that worries people the most. For sure, it worries them, but it's the idea of indefinite uncertainty. The idea that, COVID might last for a really long time, and after that, there might be a recession or a depression, and after that, there might be another thing, and after that, there might be another thing. And the reality is, of course, all of those things could happen, but that doesn't mean that it's going to automatically have to be a source of anxiety. That's a choice that people have to an extent. If they choose to greet every new development as something worrisome, to assume, this is different, it must be bad, yeah, then it's quite reasonable to worry that the future is going to entail a lot more worry. But on the flip side, if people are able to practice what I've described and start to reallocate their attention and to notice when they're going down the path of getting overly stressed out about things that aren't really necessary to worry that much about, then actually whatever happens in the future will result in less anxiety. So that, I guess I would say, is the thing that most people are stressed out about right now, most founders at least, that I think they should be less stressed out about it. If they can build up the experience and the tools to deal with anxiety, then they don't need to worry nearly as much about the fact that the world might remain uncertain for quite a while. All right, going to give one more minute for people to ask questions since we actually did get one while I was waiting to close up. All right. Well, thank you everyone again for coming today. It's been fun to present this to you from the middle of nowhere in Nevada. over a tethered phone and solar panels powering the laptop. The magic combination of technology. I hope that people found this useful. And again, here is how to read more and contact me if you've got more questions for me or more interest in the topic. Here's the slide. And okay, we got one more question. Awesome. So Teddy asks, what do you think more people should be stressed out about right now? Whoa, that's an interesting one. What do I think people should be more stressed out about right now? I think things like existential threats to humanity are probably up there on the list. Not necessarily that any individual person should be more stressed out about, say, climate change or nuclear proliferation, but those strike me as the sorts of things that actually do have the potential to kill off a very large percentage of humanity within our lifetimes. And the amount of time that most people spend worrying about or even thinking about those things is pretty small compared to how dangerous they could actually be. So I think that's the best answer I can give. And on that dark note, thanks again, everyone. I'll see you next time.